being able to put this data in really digestible, whether it's graphs or, presentations or however you want to share that information with your employees, like absolutely, it should definitely be shared. And again, going back to, meeting people where they are, maybe it is that we're sharing it with the GM and the GM has full access and then they're having one-on-one meetings with everybody because again, just showing employee D here these metrics, I think you need that human touch of this is how that's showing up and here's how we can change that. Here are the new goals because we have KPIs as a business. Every single person in the restaurant should have KPIs for themselves for, doing their job great, for their development program, and using this data to supplement those conversations is really critical.